Welcome to the Special Siblings Podcast, the only show focused exclusively on supporting siblings of kids with disabilities. Join us as we invite psychologists, researchers, parents, and siblings of all ages to weigh in on the issues facing this too often overlooked population. I'm your host, Jessica Leving, author of the children's book Special Siblings, and more importantly, a sibling myself to a brother with autism. Thanks for tuning in, and I'm looking forward to learning with you. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in. This is our very first episode of the Special Siblings Podcast, and I am so happy to have you guys listening. So here we go. For my first topic, I wanted to explore why siblings. Why do these issues even matter? I, of course, first became interested in this issue because I'm a sibling myself. My brother is 6 years younger than me and he has autism. And when we were in high school, one of the local social service agencies where he was in therapy mentioned to my mom that they were seeing a lot of siblings coming in with unique challenges of their own. And they mentioned that they really wished they had more resources, maybe a book or something that they could share with these kids because not a lot of attention had been paid to how having a brother or sister with a disability affects the other kids in the family. So, knowing that I love to write and always had my hand in different projects, my mom suggested to me when I was, I think, a sophomore in high school that maybe I could put together a picture book that they could use to help the younger kids understand the feelings they were going through as they were navigating being part of a quote unquote special needs family. So, my book, Special Siblings, was born then over 10 years ago. And today, now from a roughly bound high school project to finally being officially published just this past year, it has really been a whirlwind and I've learned a lot. And today, my book, Special Siblings, Growing Up with a Sibling Who Has Special Needs, is available on Amazon. You can find the link in the show notes. And, I've been traveling around doing readings and school and camp visits and meeting siblings and parents of all ages. And everywhere I go, people have asked me, what else? What else can I do as the parent of multiple children where one has a disability and others don't? What can I do as a teacher, as an occupational therapist, a speech therapist, a psychologist? Where can I go for more resources? And I really did not know where to point them. So I decided to create this podcast to really start answering those questions. I am not a researcher or a therapist, an expert in any way, but I do have a background in journalism. And so the biggest thing I learned in journalism is if you don't know something, find the people who do and just ask them. So that is what this podcast was created for. And you'll find in the upcoming episodes interviews that I have done with researchers and various topics and sibling issues around the world, therapists, parents themselves, creators of other programs that are out there. It's all really intended to be a little bit of a roadmap to where to go next if you're looking for more information on supporting the siblings of kids with special needs. My first guest today is one of the preeminent researchers in the world looking at psychological dynamics in sibling groups of all kinds, including, of course, siblings and families affected by disability. So we spoke by phone a while back to start off with the evidence. What does the data show about how having a sibling with a disability affects kids? I hope that you will find this topic as intriguing and interesting as I do. Well, let's get started. Hi, and welcome back to the show. I'm so excited to have Dr. Avidan Milevsky with us today. Dr. Milevsky is an associate professor of psychology at Ariel University and a psychotherapist at the Center for Mental Health in Israel. His research on siblings has produced more than 30 papers and 6 books, including Sibling Issues in Therapy. You can learn more about his work at www.avidanmilevsky.com, which of course we'll link in the show notes. So Dr. Milevsky, thank you so much for coming on the show with us today.
A pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. So I wonder if just to get us started, maybe you can talk a little bit about how you got into this work, why siblings? Why is this what you chose to make your specialty?
So like many researchers, there's always a personal connection to the research topic. I'm one of 5 siblings, 4 brothers, and a little sister. And growing up, we were very close. And we always wondered if there's something about this concept of having more sibling connections and less friend connections. So obviously we grew up with friends, but the sibling unit was an integral part of our childhood. And then when I hit the point of figuring out what I want to write my doctoral dissertation on, I figured I'll get back to that childhood question of mine, and we started looking into some sibling issues with my graduate mentor at Florida International University. And that's how the sibling piece came about, basically.
Great. Yeah. And so then are there different like overall themes and trends that have come up? I know on your website you have quite a few books that you've written about different aspects of sibling relationships. Are there like kind of a few core themes that it all centers around?
Right. So one of the main areas of my work is on siblings in general, is the question of what really creates closeness between siblings. We do know that those who are close with siblings experience life difficulties in easier ways. So there's lifespan research, literally from childhood through old age, that shows that those who have a close sibling connection do better in school as children. They have better social understanding as teenagers, less risky behavior as teenagers. Even SAT scores are linked with closer sibling connections. Adults who lose jobs or get divorced or have other turmoil in their life deal with these things in healthier ways. And even successful aging is linked
Mhm.
with close sibling relationships. So the benefits are immense. And the focus of our work primarily is to try to figure out what really impacts that closeness. So when you ask about trends, the trend for many years has been to focus on what is known as constellation variables, meaning how does gender impact the relationship? So are sisters closer than brothers? Or how does age impact it? Meaning, if I'm close in age with my sibling or farther apart, does that impact the level of our connection? Our studies, which is more of the more recent approach, is to really assess family dynamics and parenting practices and how early childhood parenting practices impact sibling relationships.
Mhm. Yeah, it's interesting, thinking about these different ways that sibling relationships can show up in other places in our lives. And I know for myself, I have a brother who has autism, and of course, the focus of our show is on, siblings who have disabilities. And I just wonder, is there data around if some of those trends are also true for kids who have a brother or sister with disabilities?
So when we're talking about sibling with disabilities, we're talking about a whole different world. And there's so many different avenues that you can take this research, and that's one of the areas of our research also, is what happens to the well siblings of children with disabilities. And I use that term well sibling, that's a very common term in the literature to refer to the children who do not have a disability. And what we see with normative sibling relationships where both of them are well, it looks very, very different when you're dealing with one of the kids in the family, one of the siblings is having some kind of difficulty or disability. So what we do know in normative samples doesn't really apply, and we need a specialized focus on families with disabilities. So it's really a whole different ballgame.
And have you been doing some of that research? Or are you familiar with, like, have there been specialized studies just on siblings with disabilities?
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, not an overwhelming amount of research. We have one of our research wings does focus on sibling with disabilities as well. The area of sibling research in general is a neglected topic. So not only with disability issues, but siblings in general. When you look at research in all different dyads of the family, so research on motherhood or fatherhood or I don't know, marital relationships. There's even more research on mother-in-law relationships than on sibling relationships. I'm not sure who's doing research on their mother-in-law, but it's interesting that this is an area that is very much neglected, siblings in general, and even more so when we're talking about research on siblings when one of the children in the family has some type of disability. So it very much needs more of a focus. It's unfortunately a neglected topic. Some people have tried to venture into explain why is that? Why are sibling relationships neglected? But it needs to be researched more because we see how powerful that relationship is, and when it's done well, what a gift it is for the rest of our life if we have a close sibling relationship. So it needs to be dealt with much more.
Yeah, I think especially when you're talking about having a sibling with a disability, as the relationship goes on, you're going to be with your sibling for probably the longest in your life, as opposed to any other member of your family. And when you're talking about someone who may really need that family support as they get older, maybe not able to live independently or going to need guardianship even when they're over 18, I think a lot of times that falls on siblings, and it would be certainly ideal if we could be building close relationships and creating support for those siblings, starting when they're really young, instead of figuring out, oh, we have a crisis when they're, in their 30s or 40s or 50s and their big family dynamic change is happening.
Right, absolutely. That's one of the themes. One of several studies that we've done with siblings with disabilities was a qualitative study where we actually did interviews with young adults who have a sibling with disability. And one of the many themes that came out of our research of that specific study is that many of them didn't really know what's going to happen in the future with their sibling. What happens when parents are unable to tend to the child with a disability? Who's going to be left with that responsibility? And the importance really, and this is one of many things that need to be discussed when it comes to this issue, but the importance of really talking to kids, talking to adolescents, young adults, about what's the plan, because many of them feel that maybe they're not going to be able to live life to the fullest because they're going to have to tend to their sibling with a disability, and that's concerning for them. So that's one of the many things that we need to take into account when we're dealing with these type of situations.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of anxiety that comes with that, both when you're thinking about what's the future going to look like, and then even just as a kid trying to navigate what does life look like when you have someone who's maybe not going through the typical school path, or your family looks different than the families you're seeing on TV or in other places. And I wonder if I don't know if there have been studies or just anecdotally in your experience as a therapist, um, it seems to me like there's a really high rate of anxiety in general among siblings. Has there ever been, are you aware of any research around if, people who have a sibling with a disability are more susceptible maybe to being diagnosed with anxiety or depression or anything like that later in life?
Right. That is interesting, and that is one of the things that we've studied and others as well. One of the things that you find is the mixed emotion concept that is often part of the experience of being a well sibling to a child with disability. So you feel bad sometimes or are embarrassed sometimes, but you're guilty of feeling an embarrassment. So mixed emotions are a big part of it, and that needs to be tended to when we're dealing with a well sibling and really give them a place to talk about those mixed emotions. But in terms of what you're asking as it relates to some type of depression or issues like that, so more or less when we talk about types of difficulties experienced, particularly during the teenage years, is the difference between internalizing and externalizing problems. So internalizing problems are things like depression, eating disorders, things that are impacting the internal life of a person. Anxiety. Externalizing problems, on the other hand, are things like delinquency or drug abuse, where that's impacting more the outside world. And studies do show that when we're dealing with well siblings of children with disabilities, they experience less externalizing because they don't want to burden their parents. But studies do indicate that these children experience internalizing problems, meaning things like depression and anxiety, but they're trying to keep it from the parents. They don't want to overburden the parents. The parents are already spending a lot of time and money and effort and emotional energy on tending to the child with a disability, and the well sibling doesn't want to burden the parent, so they just keep it inside. So if they're having difficulties in school, they don't come home and tell their parents about it. They keep it to themselves because they don't want to overburden the parents. When they're having other type of problems, dating issues, or when they are having emotional issues, they tend to keep it inside. So yeah, you definitely find these children and adolescents having internalizing problems. Now, what sometimes happens is that there's that much of a limit that you could keep internalizing problems inside. And sometimes when it could boil over, and then you see them explode in very, very destructive ways, which is, once again, a very important thing to keep in mind, and allow these well siblings to have an avenue of support to be able to deal with these internalizing problems.
Yeah, I know that was very true, certainly for myself, that I was super aware of not wanting to burden my parents, and, trying to pitch in and be the helper. And I actually was speaking to a group of parents the other day, and one of the moms was saying, oh, well, my daughter, she had two daughters, and one of them had, I think, Down syndrome. And she said of her other daughter, oh, well, she's my little helper. She's her sister's best friend. She's my little mini therapist. Like, she's doing great. This is, we're so proud of her. And she was so happy and so proud when she was talking about it. And my first thought was to be worried because that sounds like a kid who maybe is not expressing the full range of their emotions that they might be having about that situation. And it's so easy for parents to not see that. I mean, in fact, it's probably very difficult. You have to seek it out to realize, especially when a parent, parenting a child with a disability is very challenging, and you might not have it on your radar to be looking for those signs in your other kids. And I wonder if you have recommendations for parents, or what can parents do to allow their kids to feel those emotions, to share those emotions, feel safe even having them in the first place?
So you bring up a good point. You bring up 2 points. Let me bring up the first one. This concept that parents sometimes rely on the well sibling as an emotional outlet. I actually have a graduate student who just finished his master's thesis, and we're working on publishing the work now on this concept of one of the children in a family when they become some type of semi-parent. It's known in family literature as parentification. And one of the things that we found, and others also have found, is that often in families where there's a child with a disability, one of the well siblings takes on parental responsibilities, or they are a semi-parent. Once again, they're parentified. And it plays out when parents rely on them extra, or parents depend on them for emotional support. There are other types of family situations that create parentification. Other cases when parents are not functioning for whatever reason, be it issues of alcoholism or other type of issues where one of the children steps up and becomes a parent. But you also find it, and some of the results of my student very clearly found that well siblings and families with a child with disability, one of them steps up and becomes a parent, sort of. So that has to be, we have to be very, very careful with that, because studies do show that children who are parentified, if they are given parental responsibility when it's inappropriate for them to be doing these things, in some way they skip over their childhood. They aren't allowed to be kids and act like kids. They have to be responsible. They can't have friendships many times. They don't have time for extracurricular activities because they have all these responsibilities at home. And studies do show that long term it's unhealthy for people to be parentified. Kids need to be kids. So first of all, it's important for parents to find their own sources of support, be it their own siblings, be it their parents, be it support networks, and to be very careful not to depend on the well siblings as that source of support when dealing with the difficulty of having a child with a disability. So that's very important from the parental perspective. And the second point that you bring up is, what do we do for these children? And again, often they're neglected. Well siblings, family resources are very much geared towards helping the child with a disability, but we can't neglect the well siblings. Often they're suffering and they need an outlet. They need to be tended to. They need to make sure that every once in a while they have their abilities of doing extracurricular activities or family vacations. Often when there's a sibling or child with a disability, family vacations are limited in terms of how much fun they could have. They have to go to places that are accessible. And often, well siblings need to compromise on their vacation that they don't get to go to crazy, wild places, because a place needs to be a place that a child with a disability could work within.
Yeah, and I wonder if maybe there are opportunities also for trying to see, like, yeah, it's a tricky line because I was going to say, like, trying to see the positive. Like, I know there are a couple of examples where, like, when my family went to Disney World, I remember we got a disability pass because my brother had autism and he got a wheelchair, which he totally did not need. And there was a little bit of a sense of, and especially looking back, like we were totally cheating the system. Like he didn't really require the use of this wheelchair. But they gave it to us and they gave us a pass, and it came with, it was a whole package. And once you have the wheelchair and the pass, you can skip all the lines. And I remember like being so excited, like finally, oh my gosh, my brother having a disability is a huge benefit. We don't have to wait in line at Disney World. This is so great. And it was one of those rare opportunities of being able to think like, oh, well, my vacation was enhanced by this instead of some kind of a restriction put on it. But then at the same time, I always want to be careful about saying, well, let's focus on the positive, because I think, I know in a previous interview I was reading, I think you were quoted in an article on Psychiatry Advisor, and you were talking about resentment in siblings. And I think that just really sparked a lot in me, because I think that's one of those emotions that you feel like you're not supposed to have. And then the more that you feel like you're not supposed to be resentful, you feel more resentful. And so, yeah, I don't know. Do you have any suggestions on how to kind of walk that line between, like, I feel like, I wrote this book about having a sibling with special needs. And when I looked around first to see if there were other books like this, all of the ones that are out there are about, well, my sibling's so special and it might be harder for my brother or my sister to do this, but they're really good at this. Or, they're actually extra special because of this. And that's all really nice. And I think we want to encourage our kids to see everybody's strengths, even if they're not in the places we expect. But do you have maybe some like tangible suggestions for how we can build appreciation of what kids' strengths are, while also, validating that it can be difficult or embarrassing or stressful or whatever the case may be?
Right, for sure. That's definitely one of the themes that we found in one of our studies. So this mixed emotion, it's okay to have mixed emotions, and younger children may have more of a difficult time with that. But as kids get a bit older, 6, 7, 8, and they start appreciating that mixed emotions exist, it's important to give an outlet to both types of emotions, right? So the difficulty of it and supporting them during the difficulty, supporting them in the embarrassment. One of our participants noted that whenever the family goes to the mall, they insist on walking alone because they're embarrassed with their sibling that's in a wheelchair. And unfortunately, sometimes parents yell at the well sibling. Don't be embarrassed. It's your sibling. Be nice to him. Look at the difficulty that he has. Your difficulty is nothing in comparison to what he's experiencing. These are unhelpful comments.
Mm-hmm.
It's completely normal, completely natural for children to feel this embarrassment. Some of our participants noted that they don't want to bring friends home because they're embarrassed by a sibling with a disability. It's completely a normal emotion, and parents need to give space for that emotion to come out and talk about it. Parents themselves could say, yes, that was embarrassing for me as well. Validate for the well sibling that embarrassment. So it's important to give room for that. But also, what you're describing is a cute example, the Disney benefit. And actually, one of our participants said exactly the same thing. That when they go to different amusement parks, they get to cut the lines because his brother is in a wheelchair. So it's a very common positive aspect of it. But there are other positives as well. Studies show, some of them that we've done. There's a group in Australia who's doing some interesting research also on siblings with disability. And these studies are showing that these well siblings develop certain positive characteristics. They develop a certain altruism, a certain maturity. They develop empathy. They learn cooperation. There's even studies that show that many of them choose a career path in the helping professions. So they've learned how to empathize with the sibling with disability, and they have an easier time in college choosing their career, and they often become special ed teachers or nurses or doctors. They want to help others. And that's a very, very nice feature. And it's a strength-based model, which is an important thing to focus on as well. So both need to exist, the opportunity for children to deal with the negative emotions, but also the positive.
Right. And hopefully that's reassuring to any parents that are listening that are thinking, well, I don't want to encourage my child to feel embarrassed about their brother or sister. I don't want them to turn into a person that thinks it's okay to be embarrassed or uncomfortable around people with disabilities. I want them to embrace their sibling. But clearly, many of us who are siblings do eventually bridge the gap. We come out the other side, and we do feel proud and we feel committed to taking care of our sibling, being their protector, to helping other kids with disabilities. Are there any certain ways, so we talk about acknowledging the different mixed emotions. Do you have tips on how you can then still be able to give that message? Like, how do we talk to kids about, okay, that was embarrassing and it's okay to be embarrassed, or, and we still love everyone in the family, even though sometimes they're embarrassing. Do you have any language or tools around that?
Right. So it's important not to push the topic. So we obviously want them to eventually not be embarrassed or empathize. And these things are going to happen naturally if the right environment exists. So by letting them experience the negative emotion and really let them talk about it and provide an environment that permits that, over time they naturally pick up the empathy without having to push it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, these were really helpful tips, I think, for parents, especially. Do you have any tips for people who work with siblings, whether it's teachers, psychologists, other professionals? Like I even think about the other, there were always speech therapists, occupational therapists, everyone was in and out of our house. And I remember really that some of them really did an amazing job of embracing me and bringing me in, and we would do social stories around, well, when you go get ice cream with your sister or whatever. I wonder if there are any tips you have for people who are working with siblings in some other capacity besides parenting, and just things to watch for, things they can do to be helpful to make siblings feel seen.
Yeah, I think it's important to help parents acknowledge the difficulties that exist in this type of family. And I think a very important role for service providers is helping parents figure out ways of talking to children at various ages about the disability that the sibling has. One of the things that we found in our studies and others as well is that often siblings, well siblings, are kept in the dark about what's really happening. We had some heart-wrenching personal accounts from some of our participants about specific memories in their childhood, about how they knew that there was something wrong, but their parents didn't share with them what it was. So one of our participants described after their brother was born, they had to go to the hospital many times, and They left a brother in the hospital, and the parents came back to the car, and the parents were crying, but no one was telling anything to the well sibling about what's going on. And unfortunately, children's imagination is often much worse than reality. And when they're kept in the dark, they know that there's something wrong, and they go to the worst places possible in their imagination. So it's important to really help parents find the right ways of sitting with children and talking to them as clearly as possible about what is going on with your sibling. What's the diagnosis? What's the difficulty? How is it exhibited? What's the future like? So service providers have a major role in really prepping parents and first highlighting how important that is, and then finding age-appropriate ways of conveying the information to children. So when you look at it across development, younger children are interested in more of the technical things. What is it like? What is it? What is it called? What happens? As kids become a bit older, adolescents already are thinking about the future. So talking to them about what services are possible for the sibling later on in life. What happens when the parents are not available anymore? So service providers need to really help parents find ways of answering as clearly as possible the questions of the well siblings.
Yeah, I really appreciate all that like tangible advice. I think there are so few resources out there where you can just get a list of, all of the topics that are going to come up. Or I almost feel like, when you go to the doctor and you get a diagnosis for something, there are all these pamphlets on like, okay, well, what to expect from the first 2 years of, after the diagnosis from autism, what to do for early intervention. Do you think we'll ever have like a pamphlet on what to look for with your neurotypical sibling?
You're describing the fact that this doesn't exist, the fact that a pathway like this doesn't exist, which is surprising. I think it speaks to the neglect of sibling issues in general, particularly with disabilities. So there unfortunately isn't a lot of research about this topic, and it starts with research. Whatever we're doing with family members, we want to make sure that it's research-based. Often we have advice for parents when it comes to all aspects of, psychology, developmental psychology, and sometimes it's not based on sound research, what really is effective. So I think it starts with doing some good research, solid research on this issue, what's really effective for these types of families. And because there's a lack of research, could be that's translating into a lack of this information getting out to the general public as well. So I think it's very, very welcome, the focus that you're offering on this topic, and the few pockets of researchers or even some organizations that are focusing on well siblings of children with disabilities. And hopefully your efforts and your books continue to really push that forward and really help families deal with a very, very complicated situation.
I hope so. Yeah, I definitely hope that, this will be pushing the conversation forward. I'm absolutely not a scientist or researcher myself, but I hope that this work and this focus will really bring to light that there's so much still to be discovered, and that the people who are capable of doing the research will do more of it. And the people who have the funding will choose to fund these issues, because I think this can make such a huge difference in the lives of so many people. And that's, I think that's a perfect place to wrap up. We're just about out of time, but Dr. Milewski, thank you so much for being on the show with us today. This was really wonderful.
A pleasure, a pleasure.
Great. All right. Again, that was Dr. Avidan Milewski, avidanmilewski.com. We'll, of course, have the link in the show notes, and we will catch up with you next time. Thanks so much.